Well, we may as well start bang on the hour. Looks like we have critical mass on the line and our panelists with us. I'm sure that many will continue to join. But first, I'd like to say to everyone, happy Climate Week, happy virtual Climate Week. Really delighted that we had so much interest in this event despite the competition, and really happy to be sharing our thoughts today in GrowToZero, which is a somewhat enigmatic title that I'll touch on in a little bit more detail later. First, I'd like to welcome and sincerely thank our panelists joining from various time zones across the US and some very early, so thanks for that. Today, we are talking about how carbon offsetting can help drive global emission reductions and create business value as well as value for society. We have a great lineup of speakers today to discuss the topic. I'll be moderating and providing a bit of introduction, but then we'll talk to the real experts, starting with Brad Schallert from WWF, who will talk about new frameworks around corporate climate leadership, and the Science-Based Targets Initiative that's really recently released guidance on net zero, and we'll extract some key insights from that and talk about WWF's position on carbon offsetting, some thoughts there. And then we'll talk to Peggy Brannigan from LinkedIn and Peter Daring from PeakDesign to get some conversation going about how carbon offsetting fits into their overall climate strategy, and how it has created opportunities for their business and maybe some challenges. We'll get into those too. So first, maybe some brief housekeeping. We do welcome your comments. We'll leave quite a bit of time at the end to welcome your questions as well. So feel free to share those through the Q&A function as we go along. Depending on how things go, we may invite people to raise their hand as well to get some better interaction. But please feel free in the meantime to share those questions through the Q&A. We may also have our Chief Technical Officer, Owen Hewlett, schedule permitting, making a cheeky appearance to answer the difficult questions that I cannot. So where are we trying to go? I think it's important to root us in this foundation that we know we have clear goal lines. I'm sure neither of these graphics are new to anyone on the line here. The first on the left is about a really urgent, rapid decline in emissions needed to reach climate security, to preserve a stable climate and avoid kind of the more catastrophic events of climate change. Although we know that our friends in California are experiencing these as we speak. And the SDG framework has very clear goals, targets, and indicators that say where the globe has agreed on where we ought to be. So how are we doing? I think it's clear that the Paris Agreement, while impressive in terms of being able to reach an agreement, is still falling far short in terms of the commitments that we have now. And we see this as an opportunity, really, and a need for the private sector to get involved and help to close that emissions gap. And we'll talk about how carbon offsetting is one of many instruments that can help do that. This might be a year old, but it's not going to change dramatically. It's a snapshot of many countries, many of them in the developed world, to see how are we doing according to various targets. And the answer here is that we have a lot of work to do as well on the broader climate agenda. And so that brings us to why GrowToZero. This is the idea behind GrowToZero is really about accelerating progress to net zero carbon, while also catalyzing sustainable development to achieve those other big, audacious goals with zero as their target, like zero hunger, zero poverty, zero biodiversity loss. So we really want to look at climate going hand in hand with sustainable development. And as it happens, this is what Gold Standard is all about and what we've been all about since our founding in 2003. It's a requirement for all gold standard interventions in carbon markets and beyond, and new initiatives like our value change program for scope 3 reductions, that sustainable development and climate are going hand in hand. We were founded by an organization that has graciously joined us on the line, WWF, and other nonprofits who, in the wake of the Kyoto Protocol, had concerns about carbon markets, that the emerging mechanism, the clean development mechanism, wasn't delivering on that big D in the middle of the development, and had concerns about environmental integrity concerns as well. So we were created to be a quality label on top of CDM credits, and then have moved into the voluntary market as well, and are always looking to kind of raise the bar and see how markets can perform and accomplish even more. So I've set the stage a bit here. So why is, where does carbon offsetting fit into this need for climate action? We see carbon offsetting as accelerating that transition to net zero and filling 3 primary gaps. We saw that big ambition gap left from country commitments. It's clear that even some of those commitments that have been made are not yet financed. There are figures around renewable energy needs alone that requires trillions. So we really need the private sector as an opportunity to contribute to closing that finance gap through market mechanisms. And also time. We need, the best time to have acted was a couple decades ago. The next best is right now, and carbon offsetting provides a way to act now as companies and governments plan their longer term trajectories. So I've already tapped on that first benefit of carbon offsetting. It does allow for action now. I know a lot of companies are looking at science-based target setting. As the strategies are being formed, approved, and implemented, carbon offsetting can complement that measure, especially for the harder to abate sectors. And those companies that have large scope 3 footprints, which should be, of course, part of a science-based target setting exercise, but as that can be a longer haul to engage suppliers and et cetera, carbon offsetting can complement that action. So, we talked about finance. Carbon offsetting, one of the key features of markets, the concept behind it is that it's a cost-effective measure. It's seeking a lower cost of abatement. So that's one of the keys to making this work. But on the flip side of that, it actually is creating some carbon price. It's not allowing carbon pollution to be free. So where we don't yet have carbon pricing mechanisms in place, in the absence of that regulation, it can help align responsibility with climate impact and create a further incentive to reduce, because it's a real cost. There's value that we'll talk about later, but it's a real cost. A last benefit is that impacts are verified. As opposed to making kind of charitable donations, when you purchase a carbon credit to take accountability for your footprint, that's an impact that's already been verified independently. And so there's some trust and credibility there that you've achieved what you've meant to. And then, as I mentioned, in the more rigorous standards, you will also get requirements to deliver benefits to sustainable development. And that can really align with different corporate objectives. If you have, for example, a commitment to gender equality, there are plenty of projects that deliver that impact. And so I realize that we probably have some experts on the line, but maybe for those of you who are less familiar with carbon offsetting, the promise behind it is that the money that you pay for, as I mentioned, is a verified climate impact. And not only that your finance enabled it. So one of the first kind of qualities or characteristics of a carbon credit is that that project has to have demonstrated a financial need, that it's beyond business as usual. It wouldn't have happened in the absence of that carbon finance. That it's real, which maybe sounds obvious, but it taps into some of the technological requirements behind the scenes, where a baseline setting, so you can actually get to that next point, which is measure the real change with robust methodologies. That impacts are permanent, so we don't have reversals. So there are mechanisms built into that. It's most relevant in the land use sector. Again, independently verified. And something that's becoming more central to conversation now is that it's unique, so that it's not double counted or double claimed. So we'll touch on that briefly. But really, that's what's kind of the fundamental to carbon offsetting. And in the voluntary space, this a pretty busy slide, but maybe worth drawing your attention to some obvious things that you can draw from just glancing at it, is that the market has really grown over time, which is a great, great signal. We're really glad to see that the private sector is getting involved. You've seen that as compliance regulatory developments progress on the top, from Kyoto to Paris, the Sustainable Development Goals coming in line, and new compliance mechanisms are emerging, we see that the voluntary carbon market is actually being used as an instrument in compliance mechanisms, in government regulated mechanisms. So it's really showing the integrity and credibility of the voluntary carbon market in, providing, good governance and credible outcomes. So we're really seeing a movement from the early market formation and innovation, which does continue. And now we're moving into seeking a mainstreaming, so that taking accountability for climate impact becomes standard business practice. And then again, I would be remiss not to mention the quantified and verified SDG impact. We're trying to enhance that all the time, raise the bar on this end, not just to deliver more impact on the ground, but also to make these carbon credits and these projects deliver more value for business. So we're working on ways to make quantifying, monitoring, and verifying these processes simpler, and provide more tools for companies to be able to talk about these verified impacts that their finance has supported. And so maybe just a really quick overview of what's changing, because I do want to get to our other speakers, because we are at a watershed moment here. Though the Paris Agreement was signed 5 years ago, we're now at the point, we should have been at a point where a rule book has been adopted. We have some delays there, unfortunately, but still there are some fundamental differences that are worth drawing out. One is that we used to have a very binary system. It was the developed countries that made the commitments, and projects happened in developing countries. Now we have a very complex world where everyone has a target, and so the voluntary market needs to adapt to that, introduce new mechanisms and new rules so that we can manage the complexity of that system among all parties. Where it used to be only about governments, the Paris Agreement very explicitly talks about non-state actors, and specifically the private sector. Whereas we knew that there was a problem, climate change was a threat, we had science telling us that we needed to do something. Now we know exactly where we need to go. That decarbonization curve is clear. Science-Based Targets Initiative has arisen to provide that guidance to companies. And so now it's not just setting targets on what you think you might be able to do, but what needs to be done. And therefore we can prioritize and create a hierarchy on how to get there fastest and in the most credible way. And finally, whereas the Kyoto Protocol focused only on mitigation, the Paris Agreement talks about mitigation, also adaptation to support those already on the front lines of climate change, and the finance needed, which we've tapped into, and which the voluntary market can really provide a mechanism to deliver. So I'll just briefly talk about what this new world looks like in terms of carbon offsetting, how we're thinking about it as a standard and others are. We need to make sure that we're increasing ambition so that offsetting is happening not instead of, but in addition to ambitious company target setting, and that we don't undermine ambition on the country side too. So when I talked about that complex world, there are some rules that need to go into effect that manage claims and accounting in that multilateral world. And we want to focus on high-hanging fruit, talking about that resilience, adaptation, and that focus of the Paris Agreement. We want to make sure that these projects are delivering to these high development impact projects. We'll need to, as the rulebook does come online, hopefully next year, we'll need to align with that to play in that space. So there'll be developments around additionality, which is that first, beyond business as usual, making sure carbon finance is going where it's really needed, and some technical provisions that'll be also worked out in addition. Gold Standard ourselves are conscious that, in order to balance, the Paris ambition talks about balancing emissions with sinks. So we'll be looking at how to build a long-term pipeline for carbon removals, which I know a lot of companies that have committed to science-based targets are particularly interested in, because in the long term, they'll be seeking removals to meet their residual emissions to make a net zero claim. We'll also see new opportunities for financing reductions. I'll talk about that a little bit later. And talking about carbon removals, we're thinking that there's an opportunity to make that a distinct asset because it has a different climate impact and has some different challenges as well. I mentioned permanence. So we think there's an evolving role for carbon offsets that are actually removals. And then again, looking at this changing world, what different claims are credible and logical for credits that have these different attributes. So I'll just use this to paint the picture that we have kind of a brave new world of claims. I think we need clarity on this, and we have some thinking on this. I think Brad from WWF will have a bit more to say as well. It's something that we'll work towards so that companies have better clarity. I think we applaud that people are moving forward in the absence of these claims, but that we need to, there's some work to be done to make sure that everyone's, what's the difference between carbon neutral and net zero, or is there one? Climate positive, what does that mean? But I think the takeaway is really that a science-based reduction target is the assumption, and then taking full responsibility for residual emissions should become best practice. Just a quick note to mention that there are I talked about new opportunities to finance emission reductions. Gold Standard has an initiative with science-based targets partners to enable the accounting of emission reductions in the value chain, and something that can be consistent with the greenhouse gas protocol and reported towards science-based targets. So contact us if you're interested in that. We also have a program about trying to quantify sustainability standards that issue commodities like FSC, Fair Trade, MSC, and others, so that in addition to being able to say your chocolate has been fairly traded, it also has a lower carbon footprint that you can claim, again, to the GHG protocol and science-based targets. We also, in that changing landscape around nature-based solutions, we think there's an opportunity for new ways to finance forest conservation and potentially removals as well, that are maybe outside of the carbon credit mechanism. And just in the interest of time, a quick shout again to, not to forget the sustainable development impacts. We have an opportunity to actually quantify that per carbon credit. So I think that's something that's really, to keep in mind the economic value that's delivered of a carbon credit, not just the real cost that's involved in purchasing that credit. So not only you can take responsibility for your carbon footprint, but demonstrate real economic value creation to these different SDGs. Okay, so Brad, I shall be your driver. So please, okay. Brad Schallert, take it away.
All right, thanks, Sarah. Nice to be with you all today. So Sarah talked a little bit in her presentation about this notion that offsetting or voluntary offsetting, or what I like to term purchasing carbon credits on a voluntary basis. Not a fan. Sarah and I talk about this a lot, but not a fan of the term offsetting in a sense, because there's a certain baggage that comes with it, right? So in sort of the new paradigm that we're moving into, we're thinking about different ways to sort of help companies understand how they can complement their internal emissions reduction strategies with carbon credits, instead of being kind of stuck in the old Kyoto world, as Sarah said. So I'm gonna do this. Going to talk a little bit about how to think about complementarity with internal reductions, but by looking at two different climate frameworks. One was created in 2018. It was the WWF Gold Standard and CDP framework, and the other is the Foundations for Science-Based Net Zero Target Setting in the Corporate Sector paper, which was released on September 15th by the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which WWF is a part of. And I was a reviewer of this paper, many rounds of it. So I'm going to talk about those two. Next slide, please. This framework, again, 2018, this came out. Next slide, sir. And there's really 4 components of it. So the first is you're measuring and disclosing your carbon. 2 is that you're reducing, and you're doing that in line with climate science. So this is where the emphasis on the science-based target is in this second triangle. And then third, there's this sense that we need to fill this climate finance gap, right? And finance that transition to the low carbon or to the zero carbon economy. That in this framework is talking about financing scope 3 emissions reductions. But it's also talking about financing beyond your science-based target. And then there's also a policy pillar here too. I think that the key takeaways I want you to get from this is that, again, there's an emphasis on the science-based target as the sine qua non of climate action for a company. And then it's starting to step away from this concept of netting out your remaining emissions, actually, and thinking more about just investing beyond it, and even thinking about framing it in terms of like a financial amount, right? Not necessarily in terms of tons. So we might go into that a little bit later in this presentation or in the Q&A, but it's a different way to frame this as opposed to carbon neutrality or even net zero. So in this paper, the term climate neutrality or carbon neutrality doesn't even come up. So interesting point there. I think the other thing is that it recognizes that carbon credits are a means to finance this transition, but it's not the only way that you finance it, right? So we'll get into that a little bit later too. Next slide. So our WWF position on voluntary carbon markets was largely based off this. I'm not going to go into the detail of this now. At the end, there's a link if you'd like to see the position. But we asked these questions, and particularly when you should buy carbon credits is a big one. So, but again, not enough time to go into that. I just wanted to flag that we have this. So next one is to talk more about this paper that was released. It was released with a lot of expectation from a lot of different stakeholders. I think I heard that on the webinar where they launched this, there were over 1,000 participants listening in. So there's been a lot of expectations from companies, from consultants, from NGOs, from governments on what this was going to say. But it provides this conceptual foundation for net zero targets. And I think, again, the main difference, maybe not again, but the main difference between this framework and the other framework that I was just talking about is that this one is looking at netting out of emissions. And I mean, it's about net zero targets, right? So that's a key difference here. It looks into about what could be used to count towards net zero targets too. I think another key point is that it talks about this concept of a mitigation hierarchy. Not all, climate mitigation is equal. You want to first prioritize what's within your operations, then your value chain, and then go beyond that. And in this paper, it's looking at 5 different illustrative scenarios, and I'll go to one in just a second. But next slide, Sarah. So as part of this whole process, there is this big question: what will science-based targets say is net zero emissions? What is the definition of it? And they largely tacked to the IPCC definition, which is, this is a summary of that definition. It's a balance between emissions removals over a given time period. So you can only reach net zero in the science-based targets world if you are using removals toward it. So that's a key point that I'll come back to in just a second. What this paper recommends among the 5 different illustrative approaches is this, what they call the climate positive approach. So you can see the graph to the right here, and you have gross emissions. You see that trajectory of net emissions going down, and in that target year, which is probably, I think, around 2050 or so, 2040 here, you want to reach that. And in years running up to that, you're using compensation measures and then transitioning to neutralization measures. So what do I mean by that? Compensation in this paper means carbon credits based on emissions reduction. So carbon credits that are avoiding emissions, right? So cook stove projects are a good example of that. Trees would have been cut down, you introduce cook stoves, and you're avoiding emissions that would have happened otherwise. Neutralization means pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and sequestering it. So that's removals. So emissions reductions versus removals. And so you can see this transition over time to removals. And this is the preferred approach that Science-Based Targets paper is talking about. And just click one more time here. But I think that the overall I guess, takeaway that I would have for this is that carbon credits can be used as a compensation measure for the remaining emissions on the road to net zero. So while you can't meet net zero with any sort of carbon credit, you should be purchasing along the way, because we really care about this area under the curve, right? We need to have action immediately. And so I hope that that's a message from the paper that's coming through, and not about the endpoint of reaching net zero. I think on this point of removals versus avoided emissions, or carbon credits based on emissions reductions, as the paper says, there has been an increased interest in removals. And there are a lot of factors that are driving this, but one is, and probably one of the bigger ones, is the large corporate commitments to invest in removals. So we've seen Shell, we've seen Microsoft with big commitments in this regard. We've also seen the Net Zero Foundation's paper, anecdotal evidence which suggests that even talking about this and talking about net zero has turned companies to look more about tree planting and other sorts of ways to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And I think it has kind of set up a perverse incentive here, because the price of removal credits, and this is anecdotal as well, but I've heard that they're going up, right? And it could be at the expense of other project types. So just something to consider here. If we really want to implement the mitigation hierarchy, we really should be thinking about avoiding emissions and getting emissions reductions first before jumping into removals. Now, there's a little bit of nuance to this, and my colleague Martha Stevenson from our WWF US Forest team, what she likes to say is that right now is the decade of action for emissions reductions, but it's also a decade of readiness for removal. So we can't just wait for removals to happen. We need to start making some strategic investments to build up that capacity and that scale to be in a good position to meet net zero at a global level. So among the different commonalities of these frameworks here, I think that the first one is that both are looking at science-based targets as the core of a corporate climate action strategy. Second is that carbon credits can play a role, especially in the near term. There is a recognition in these frameworks too that it's not just only investments, mitigation investments that deliver a verifiable outcome, and I think it is great that we have that with the carbon credit infrastructure. But there are other investments out there that we should at least be keeping an eye on as potentials, and I'll get into that in just a little bit here. And then finally, just making sure that we're applying this mitigation hierarchy as we're rolling out our climate strategy. So those are the commonalities. But we as WWF, we do see a few existing gaps in the framework still. So one is this recognition of what we're calling system change investments. So there are investments that might not lend themselves to the carbon finance model, but are super important. So financing, enabling conditions in different countries. A good example is land tenure in certain countries, right? That's super important for ensuring, that people have an incentive to protect their land. So that doesn't necessarily fit within a carbon finance model all the time, but it's super important to invest in. And we do think there needs to be more emphasis on what happens before companies reach net zero. I get varying sort of responses to this paper on whether that message is getting out or not, and I hope that it is, because we aren't in a position to reach net zero globally unless we're taking action now. And we also, as WWF, think there can be a little bit more work done on thinking about how companies are sizing that financial commitment to remaining emissions. if you take a pure carbon neutrality approach and are just trying to buy the cheapest credit, that's not the best approach to do this. So we're doing some additional thinking into how companies can go about this process and think about how much they want to invest in that to deliver the greatest amount of impact. So that's just a tease that we will be coming up with a new framework fairly soon here, and trying to address a lot of those gaps that I just mentioned. So thanks very much.
Thanks so much. Yeah, thanks. Let's move on to your links page here. Although they're not super intuitive, we will share the slides.
Yeah.
We will share the slides after the fact so that people don't have to write furiously.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Brad. I think key messages are action needed now. Let's not delay. Let's start taking responsibility for climate impact on the road to net zero. Peter and Peggy, may I invite you to reveal yourselves to our audience?
Morning, sir.
Good morning to both of you, who I know it's early on the West Coast, so thanks so much.
Hi, everybody.
Welcome. So we have two very different, business models and different approaches to climate action. So Peggy, can we start with you? And do you mind just giving a snapshot or an overview of how LinkedIn is thinking about your climate strategy?
Yeah, I'd love to. I guess what I can share is how you take these concepts that we're discussing and then try to turn them into an actual implementation plan. So for me, that started 4 years ago when I joined LinkedIn, and I have the privilege to direct their global environmental sustainability program. And 3 months after I joined, our company was bought by Microsoft. So I want to give you that big picture context that we are very much in alignment with our parent company and their climate commitments and protocols. So the first thing that I did was implement an internal carbon fee. And honestly, I used the blueprint that TJ DiCaprio and team at Microsoft published in 2013, which is a playbook for how you take these concepts and approach the different divisions within your company, educate them about the importance of climate action and addressing our carbon footprint, and then assigning a percentage responsibility to each of the business units for creating a fund to offset and remove the carbon. So that's what I did, and it was a process of about a year. And there was some initial resistance because the feeling was, we don't do offsets because that absolves people of the guilt and takes away the motivation for action. And I'll just say succinctly, the opposite has happened, that's become a vehicle for me to go to our data center, the head of operations for data center, and have a conversation about, these are the emissions, this is the trajectory, what can we do to reduce, replace, and remove? So over the course of the 4 years, we've developed a sort of a set of guiding principles about how we approach carbon. And if you think about what our footprint, consists of, it's largely our data center use, which is going to continue to grow, and then our workplaces and our business travel. And so we have an approach, first of all, always to try to manage the load, reduce, drive efficiencies. So reduce our energy use, replace our fossil fuel use with renewable use wherever we can, and then offset and remove our carbon emissions. And the big context for LinkedIn is that that's important because that's taking care of our own footprint. But for us, we want to ask the bigger question, which is, how can we scale our impact across the rest of the marketplace? What are the unique assets that LinkedIn has to invest in this climate fight? So for us, it's our platform. It's our 700 million members. It's our online learning. It's our jobs marketplace. So I'm very much involved in sort of the trying to spread the word and provide tools and information about carbon through our platform. And then I'll just mention, briefly, You may have seen in January that Microsoft and LinkedIn made a pledge, a public commitment to become carbon negative by 2030. And the biggest new piece of this for us is scope 3. So we're going to drive scope 1 and 2, our direct energy use and electricity, down near zero by 2025. And you're probably familiar with Microsoft's energy purchasing activity. And then the scope 3, drive it down by more than half by 2030. And the biggest challenge really is, remaining authentic and transparent within the science-based targets. So it's the data collection. It's really, can we develop the baseline to understand what is our current carbon footprint in scope 3, and in particular in our supply chain. So I'm deeply involved now with CDP and the supply chain program, and working much more closely with our suppliers to help all of them on their journey as well. So that's sort of a summary of journey so far.
Great. Thanks a lot. And thanks very much for dispelling the myth that seems to persist, that that offsetting is an excuse not to take climate action. It's been a misconception that we've all been battling for quite some time, and research has disproven. So I'm glad to hear that that also is the case within
Well,
LinkedIn.
and I think what's important is to use an internal carbon fee so that there's a real impact on the individual business groups not balance sheet, their income statement, their contribution. They'll either pay upfront or they'll pay afterward, and it's so much better to take those funds. So we have a sustainability fund now, and invest them in technologies and activities and new policies so we continue to reduce emissions. So
that's great. That end. I think that's great, because that opens up the possibility for innovation as well.
Exactly.
There's a real cost involved, and so you get people brainstorming on how to reduce, but keeping everyone accountable. I think that's great, and that can happen at a business unit level or at a broad company level, I think, as well. So could you talk a little bit more about your carbon removals plan? Because Brad touched on this, as did I. Yeah. It's a moving landscape. Pardon the pun.
Yes, absolutely.
So could you talk a bit more?
Yeah, and so as former speakers have mentioned, there's sort of, we want to avoid emissions, and we also want to remove emissions that are in the atmosphere. And so our portfolio of investments for climate involve both. And I'll just tell you, when we make a decision about what we're going to invest in, in addition to like the verified environmental benefits, we also look for projects and opportunities that really clearly promote growth in green, sustainable jobs. And that where we can have a longer term relationship with these organizations. So if I were to tell you the profile of our current, investments, it includes some avoidance. So for example, investment in a solar water heater factory in Bangalore, near Bangalore, which is very close to our largest operation in Asia Pacific area. That's innovative, it's green jobs, it's avoiding carbon, it's all, all goodness to that local community and anyone who buys their product. But on the other hand, in terms of carbon removal, we're starting with afforestation and reforestation. We have projects in Mexico and Brazil that are not only protecting current forests, but expanding into areas that didn't have forest, and then replacing trees in other areas. But I know that, if we refer to Microsoft's carbon removal significant fund that they've created to spur innovation and help startups, they're looking at things like soil carbon sequestration, bioenergy use, carbon capture and storage, direct air capture, and we're looking at those things too, even beyond credit. So for example, we're quite involved with a number of companies that have concrete carbon sequestration features. And in our headquarters in Silicon Valley, we've just poured a whole bunch of new concrete, and it is carbon sequestering concrete. So we're actually capturing the emissions from someone else's emissions, would
Right.
capture that, take the gas, turn it into a powder, and it's injected into the cement that goes into the concrete. So, there's some beautiful things you can do outside of the scope of what would give you credit that, has very material impacts.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think it's really encouraging to see kind of collaboration within value chains, sharing
Yeah.
incentives and impact. Well, thanks so much. I'd like to move to Peter for the moment, talk about PeakDesign, a very different business model, different challenges. And I think it'd be great to hear what brought you to be really active in climate action space and what you're doing with PeakDesign at the moment.
Thanks, Sarah. Well, let's see here. As a little introduction, PeakDesign is a company. We make outdoor and photography gear. We, at this point, do somewhere between $50 and $100 million worth of business. And in 2017, I realized what that looks like in actual physical terms of goods being shipped. It was on one of my factory visits to Vietnam, which is our bag factory, and just 1 month's supply of materials. I mean, just a massive warehouse full of materials. And to see that and understand that the principal negative externality of that is carbon. And I did not know what our carbon footprint was. I certainly considered myself environmentally inclined for many years, but I found it strange that I had no concept of what my footprint was. And so I looked around for footprinting consultancies. I wound up with 3 degrees here in San Francisco, and they charged $40,000 to evaluate that carbon footprint. They used some blunt instruments at first and by the way, I also want to make really clear here, we're talking about scope 3 footprint. PeakDesign's scope 1 and 2 footprints combine for less than 1%, like an almost immeasurable component of our carbon footprint. And that is true for the vast majority of companies that make physical things. It's not true for LinkedIn and Microsoft. Microsoft actually might be getting close now that they have significantly more physical products, but the vast majority of their input is scope 3. And Peggy, I would challenge Microsoft. If you're going to go 2030, go carbon neutral using removals. By the way, it bugs me that the term carbon offset has become so taboo. It frustrates me to no end that we dance around this concept with removals and mitigations and this and that. And semantics has just like really destroyed this concept, which is the exact same thing. Yes, there's a distinction between removals and avoidance. I do appreciate that. But if a ton is a ton is a ton, then there is no difference at the end of the day. And that's on the organizations like Gold Standard and Vera and the other worldwide organizations to come together and simply ensure that that commodity is being traded accurately. But I probably lost my thread there as it pertains to scope 1 and scope 2 and scope 3. Peggy, I think I was challenging you guys. If you're going to do it by 2030, why not just do it now? I really don't understand if a company like, go ahead, please.
No, so we are already carbon neutral. We've been carbon neutral since 2016. So this new commitment is to go significantly above and beyond that, because we recognize that some other companies can't. And so we are investing. We've created a $1 billion fund to spur innovation for carbon removal. And then they have, separate funds for all of the offsetting.
Is scope 3 currently offset, or I thought that wasn't happening?
Scope 3 is, yes, and we just increased the amount of that we're charging internally for that.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
That is, quite frankly, the whole. Anyway, to complete the story, went through, measured our carbon footprint, observed that at current carbon offset pricing, it was 1/5 of 1% of our revenue to become completely carbon neutral as it pertained to scope 1, 2, and 3, primarily 3. And so it begged the question, if PeakDesign can afford to do this, I mean, we're certainly not a massive company, and I'd say we have average profitability. Why isn't every single company in the world pursuing this? And of course, if every single company pursues removals immediately, there aren't enough to go around. It's not even close. You saw that
Right.
slide where we have 150 million tons that were purchased on the world market in the largest year of expansion. We put out 55 billion tons annually. But why isn't, while the price remains attainable, why isn't every company with a modicum of responsibility pursuing full scope 1, 2, and 3 neutrality? It slays me.
Yeah, just to clarify something, Peter, I mean, I think your point on that should be the expectation and the benchmark is clear. And I think that's what Brad underscored. I think when you get to the distinction between carbon removals and avoided, that's a longer term play because it'll take time to get there. And it is actually a different climate impact. When you're sequestering carbon from the atmosphere, it is 1 ton, but it's 1 ton that's actually removed from the atmosphere versus 1 ton that's avoided. So that's why the distinction is there. But as he said, we gotta avoid, I mean, let's need carbon removals less. Let's avoid as much as we can now. So definitely on board with that.
Certainly. I'm sure that Brad and I could have, and all of us could have an enlivened discussion about that. But
it's important to clarify. I'm sure there are a lot of people on the call who have the same impression and concern. So thanks for raising it.
That there is a mitigation hierarchy makes sense, and I do appreciate that. I have the personal belief that it should be. You know, it's another thing I think, and this comes up commonly. There is kind of there's a knock on companies pursuing the cheapest offsets out there, and I actually take a different approach. I think that companies, if we're going to use grow to zero as the mantra, that infers that capitalism is going to be a part of this march forward, and any business ought to, within the bounds of laws and regulations and general morality, be pursuing things at the cheapest available rate, and that marginal cost of abatement will go up. We will pursue the higher hanging fruit when the lower hanging fruit gets gobbled up. What we need companies to do all around, and especially companies with large scope 3 emissions, accept responsibility for those emissions. You will gobble up that low hanging fruit so quickly, and then we can all get to the high hanging fruit. We don't even have to debate whether removals or avoidances are the important thing to pursue, because we are going to be desperate for all of them. That's my thoughts.
Great. Thanks, Peter. Well, you've already done, I was going to ask a follow-up question on your advocacy, but you've already done the job just now. You're very clear and choosing to set the expectation. But maybe do you want to give a quick word about how the initiative that you've co-founded as well?
Yes, certainly. All of this kind of realization of like, wait a second, it's 1/5 of 1%, and now approximately 1/2 of 1%, because we have seen prices rise. If this is the cost for my company and other companies to go climate neutral, how come everyone isn't pursuing it? And we looked around at the landscape of like, basically we were members of 1% for the Planet, a very clear eco label. And I wanted to join the label that said, you have measured the entirety of your carbon footprint and you have mitigated it all. I wanted this black and white thing. Did you pay for your carbon or didn't you? And when we looked around at the landscape of those labels and net zero commitments, it was this sort of confusing mire. And I just wanted a very simple, clear label. Did you pay for your carbon or didn't you? And we hired 3 Degrees to do an analysis of the existing landscape of eco labels out there. And we decided that it was genuine, that there was a need for this and it was worth our time to pursue it. And so now I have 2 jobs. One of them is running PeakDesign, and one of them is as the co-founder of Climate Neutral. And we did just that. We created a label. We also created a measurement tool, a scope 3 measurement tool that is free for all businesses to check out. Our model now charges a nominal fee for certification. But even for people to know their carbon footprint, scope 3, and to do it for free within a reasonable degree of accuracy is, for me, that contribution to the world makes all the efforts of climate neutral very well worth it.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it's great that you've brought the consumer into this so that people can see, so that I think it's building more value for the brand, I would imagine. You know, building consumer trust and delivering on their expectations to be taking action and making that, easily recognizable, I think is great.
Thank
So
you.
thanks for living Pillar 4, Peter. We should shift to Q&A for all panelists. So I actually do see the Q&A. I finally came into the 21st century and figured out how to bring multiple screens up. So I will ask Brad to answer the first question I see here, which is around, Brad, where did this go? What project types do you see at risk of being kind of forgotten in this frenzy for nature-based solutions, or even more specifically carbon removals?
Yeah, and I just gave and I actually responded to it in the chat.
Okay.
Yeah, it's okay.
That's why I couldn't find it.
I mean, yeah, I just gave a couple of examples of projects that might not necessarily be as, compelling in terms of being able to tell a story, but are considered in the literature to be very additional. And for example, N2O destruction projects, mitigation projects, those are on average quite cheap too, but still, like that price doesn't necessarily imply that it's low quality. I think that's something else to point out here. That's not necessarily correlated with quality, which is a common misconception, and I think something we need to get away from. Certain project types will just cost more for certain reasons, and some might be very additional, but they are on average lower cost.
Right. No, I hear on that one, and I think we can, as a proxy, that I think some of the work that we commission from Vivid Economics to quantify the economic value, since a dollar is a metric that runs through all of that can be fungible, I guess, is a nice way to look at kind of that development profile of those types of projects. I'll take a question, and I'll maybe provide some thoughts, and I would be happy to hear from the panel. The question is, if a company can't make a claim for which they get some business value, such as carbon neutrality, how do you ensure that the finance doesn't become perceived as philanthropic? Maybe just a quick comment from my side. I think we shouldn't underestimate the power that a new claim could make. Something that, I mean, we're talking about taking full responsibility for your carbon footprint. And you think of it like a ledger. Just because the words carbon or climate neutral may or may not be used for a given approach, I think there's, I always make the comment that 5 years ago, no one knew what a science-based target was, and now it's the leading, standard for setting a climate target. So I don't know if anybody else might want to, I guess specifically the companies involved. Peter or Peggy, do you have any comments about, if you don't have that claim on carbon neutrality, does that affect your willingness to engage, or do you have concerns that it would be seen as philanthropic?
Well, first of all, there's nothing wrong, I think, with an action being seen as philanthropic, because that enhances the brand in a different way. But clearly there's kind of a, co-benefit if you are able to, further your environmental impacts and also have the credit.
I think I'll just briefly, I'll say that I think that right now there is still an opportunity for companies to get ahead of the curve and being seen as leaders in this space. I think, and hopefully that will quickly turn over to, if you're not offsetting your carbon, you're a bad actor at that point.
Yeah.
That inflection, I think, is going to happen at pretty breakneck speed because of all these claims of carbon neutrality, which I do think, of course, should be certified by some organization out there.
Peter, do you do any outreach to clusters in order to reach innovative startups in various industries? I don't fully comprehend that question. Maybe you do. If not.
I specifically to clusters, I think the answer either way is probably not. No, at this point, there's a lot of inbound traffic and interest right now, and we're kind of letting that show up at the doorstep. And you know, the budget of climate neutral is $500,000 each year. That doesn't afford that many employees, and hopefully that can grow someday, and we can do a lot more outreach.
Great. This one I think I'm going to give to you, Brad. What implications should we expect of Article 6 to the voluntary carbon credits market?
Yeah. Easy. No.
Yep.
So I think in the last round of negotiations last December, there was the way that the text was being written suggested that most countries are looking at the voluntary carbon market as connecting to the Paris Agreement. And what I mean by that is I think that most negotiators are thinking that if companies are buying carbon credits, that there is what's called a corresponding adjustment on the government side. Basically, the government says to a company, okay, you can use this and claim this to your target if I allow that, and I'm also going to make an adjustment to my basically NDC, or an account that's a ledger based on the NDC, which makes their target harder to achieve effectively. So that there's this basically a connection between the voluntary corporate accounting system and the national system. So that seemed to be the direction that countries were going in. It wasn't the top issue that they were struggling with, but there are signs in the text that is the view of the negotiators. There's a lot of discussion on this and whether that's the right way to go. I mean, as WWF, we feel that it is of value to merge those systems together so that there's a signal, you know, to governments, a way to sort of link the private sector investment in to NDCs in this direct way. But there's a lot of complexity around it, right? And there's not the capacity to do that right now because we don't have Article 6 finished. And even if it was finished, would there be sort of point people in different countries to make a decision about whether, you know, that a company could, you know, claim those carbon credits? So there's a lot of complexities there, and I think that the thing to recognize is that I don't think that the voluntary carbon market and companies should be putting that as their first priority to think about and stop investing because this hasn't been figured out, right? Continue to do what you're doing. Make sure that you're investing because we do not want the voluntary to fall off a cliff. It's an important, you know, a source of investment for climate action.
Yeah, I think we see our role as managing that complexity behind the scenes, and that you know, companies should, you know, trust us to take care of that. There's a question about, in the voluntary market, how can we counter the skepticism of consumers that trees planted will burn down anyway? Is there a good way to communicate to consumers the assumptions taken on the buffer for project risks, especially on forestation projects? I'll make a comment on this because it's kind of relative to our rules. You've answered the question within the asking. I think the buffer mechanism is quite a significant safeguard. I mean, we're talking about it with gold standard, it's a 20% issuance. 20% of all carbon credits go into that buffer in the case of a reversal. So that has not been a challenge to environmental integrity to date. I don't anticipate, you know, with that large buffer, I don't anticipate that it would be. So in terms of communicating it clearly, I think just, you know, trust the standards. The standards have these provisions to take care of, you know, concerns around environmental integrity. And to go with, I'm really glad to see a lot of, you know, new players come into the space. I do think it's worth looking at the standards, for example, that were recognized to CORSIA as an example, to make sure that the shiny new thing is not seen as a panacea, because there's been, you know, almost 20 years invested into getting this right. So there's a reason that we're called the gold standard, I'd like to think, and that other standards were, for example, accepted in compliance mechanisms. Let's see, I think we're at time. Maybe I'll try to take one question on pricing is not going to be simple.
Sarah, I can answer one quick question. Someone asked how big LinkedIn's scope 3, supply chain, et cetera, is compared to scopes 1 and 2, and it's roughly 5 times larger. And so, that's,
is that right?
That's huge.
That's significant.
And I think the whole market is realizing that scope 3 is really where we need to focus.
It's where the action is.
And help suppliers along on the journey, how we can,
Yep. I'll just make a quick comment on the main barriers to further development of the voluntary carbon market. There is a task force currently that Mark Carney of Bank of England has convened to look to scale the voluntary carbon market. Owen Hewlett, our Chief Technical Officer, sits on that working group. So there's some efforts there. Internally at Gold Standard, we're trying to remove barriers. We realize that to maintain environmental integrity, it's really complex. But again, when we talk about shifting, managing the complexity on our side around anything with corresponding adjustments and Article 6 stuff, we also need to start managing that complexity on our side to make it easier to bring projects to market, get them through the certification process, that they can, understand our rules, apply them, and get certified and bring more supply to rising demand. So there's digitization plays some role, but there's also some capacity building and some simple streamlining that we can do as well. So happy to pick up that conversation with Frank. I appreciate that we're 1 minute over, so I'd really like to close it here, but thank Peter, Brad, and Peggy. Thanks for joining us and contributing to a lively conversation at this lively time in the market. It's exciting to see what potential there is. And I agree with you, Peter. People who aren't taking this action should be seen as bad actors. So let's go start naming and shaming.
I'll get right on it.
All right.
Thanks for organizing.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. Great attention.